The vehicle was about 6 meters long, painted dark olive green, and built around a single design rule. Once the pilot was sealed inside, the cockpit could not be opened from within. It had no throttle to ease back and no landing gear, because it was never meant to land. It was shaped roughly like an aircraft, with one purpose: from the moment of its release to the moment it struck whatever was in front of it. In the autumn of 1944, a young pilot walked across a concrete apron at a naval air station, climbed through the small hatch, and let the ground crew close it behind him. The pilot settled into his seat, adjusted the simple rudder pedals, and checked the 3 solid fuel rockets at the tail. When the time came, those rockets would fire in sequence and accelerate the vehicle to approximately 650 kilometers per hour. At that speed, aimed at the hull of an enemy warship, the nose section containing 1,200 kilograms of explosive would detonate. What the pilot would experience between that moment and the end of the impact was not discussed in the official briefings. It was a question no one was expected to ask. The vehicle was called the Ohka, a Japanese word meaning cherry blossom. The young men who flew it were called the Thunder Gods. The American sailors who first encountered it in combat gave it a different name. They called it Baka, a Japanese word meaning fool. The 2 names tell you most of what you need to know about how each side understood what was happening.
The Ohka was proposed in June of 1944 by a transport pilot named Ensign Mitsuo Ota. He was 22 years old and had no background in aircraft design. He arrived at his proposal through a combination of technical logic and the psychological framework that the Imperial Navy had been constructing for the previous 2 years around the concept of TOCO, special attack operations, in which pilots flew their aircraft directly into enemy ships. The logic was simple. If a piloted aircraft could guarantee impact, it would be more accurate than a bomb released from altitude, which could miss. The accuracy problem was solved by using the pilot as the guidance system. The survivability problem was not addressed because within the framework Ota was working in, it was treated as a feature rather than a constraint. Ota submitted his design through official channels. It reached the Naval Aeronautical Establishment and was received with a mixture of enthusiasm and institutional reservation. The enthusiasm was genuine, a weapon with theoretical accuracy far exceeding any conventional bomb. The reservation was quieter. Building aircraft designed specifically for pilots to die in felt to some engineers like an admission that the Navy could no longer produce pilots capable of conventional combat effectiveness. This reservation did not stop production. The Ohka entered development in August of 1944. By September, a prototype had been built and tested in glide trials, with the pilot exiting through the open hatch before impact. By October, 852 production units had been ordered. The design had been accepted before the delivery problem had been fully examined.
The Ohka could not take off under its own power. It had to be carried to the operational area, slung under the belly of a mothership, and released within gliding range of the target. The aircraft chosen for this role was a twin-engine medium bomber that American fighter pilots had been calling the Flying Lighter since 1942. The nickname came from its tendency to ignite when struck by gunfire. The aircraft had entered service in 1941 as a long-range maritime strike plane and performed well in the early campaigns. By 1944, it was obsolete. Its self-sealing fuel tanks had been removed to reduce weight, making it highly vulnerable to incendiary rounds. Its defensive armament was insufficient against modern fighter aircraft. Its maximum speed without the Ohka attached was approximately 420 kilometers per hour. With the Ohka slung beneath the fuselage, this fell to approximately 350, slower than most Allied fighters by more than 200 kilometers per hour. And with the handling characteristics of an aircraft carrying significantly more weight than its designers had planned. The problem was recognized immediately. Naval planners calculated that a carrier bomber with an Ohka attached would need fighter escort to survive the approach to its release point.
The fighter aircraft required for this escort did not exist in sufficient numbers by early 1945. The Navy had been converting its remaining fighters to kamikaze aircraft. The Ohka program was, at its core, dependent on a delivery aircraft that could not be protected.
Operation Tan, the first combat deployment of the Ohka, took place on March the 21st, 1945. 18 carrier bombers, each with one Ohka attached underneath, launched from a base in Kyushu and flew south toward the American Carrier Task Force operating near Okinawa. The formation was detected by American radar approximately 80 kilometers from the fleet. A combat air patrol of approximately 50 fighters was vectored to intercept. The fighters engaged the carrier formation before any Ohka had reached its release range of 35 kilometers. All 18 carrier bombers were shot down. Every one of the Ohka pilots died, still sealed inside their weapons, which went down with the burning aircraft. Not one Ohka was released in combat. The American After Action Report noted the new weapons found in the wreckage with clinical interest. It described the design, noted the absence of an escape mechanism, and suggested that the primary tactical countermeasure was to engage the carrier aircraft before release point. The Thunder God's first operation had killed all 18 pilots without inflicting any damage on the American fleet. Naval planners reviewed the results and made adjustments to doctrine, but not to the fundamental architecture. The carrier bombers would continue as the delivery aircraft. The Ohka would continue to be loaded with pilots. The operations would continue.
The pilots who flew the Ohka were volunteers. This fact requires careful examination because the word volunteer operated differently in the institutional context of the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1944 and 45 than it does in its ordinary meaning. Pilots were asked to volunteer. The question was asked in formation, publicly, with the specific framing that those who did not raise their hands would be recorded as not having done so. In an institution where social obligation and group identification were primary values, where the shame of being seen not to volunteer was visceral and permanent, and where the alternative was conventional combat that was equally lethal at lower speeds, the act of volunteering was experienced by many participants as less a choice than a statement about who you were. Some pilots genuinely wished to volunteer. They had absorbed the framework the Navy had been constructing since the Midway losses of 1942, the framework that reframed individual deaths as national offerings, as cherry blossoms that bloomed and fell in a way that gave the falling meaning. Other pilots volunteered and spent the waiting period before deployment in a state of psychological tension that their letters home sometimes document with painful directness. One pilot wrote to his parents, "I do not know how to say what I am thinking. I will say that I am not afraid. I hope that when you read this, you will believe it, even if you suspect otherwise." He was 20 years old.
Once assigned to the Thunder Gods unit, a pilot received approximately 1 week of training. The training did not include practice approaches at target ships. It consisted primarily of glide tests in an unpowered trainer version of the aircraft to give the pilot familiarity with the handling characteristics at high descent angles. At release, the Ohka descended steeply and required constant control input to maintain target alignment. At rocket ignition, the acceleration was violent, reaching maximum speed within approximately 8 seconds. At that speed, the pilot had very limited time to make final adjustments before impact. The training prepared pilots for the physical experience of the cockpit. It could not prepare them for the operational reality of being released from a burning aircraft in the middle of a fighter engagement. The records of the training sessions show completion rates. Most pilots who began the training completed it. Some did not. The reasons were coded in the paperwork as medical. Some pilots requested transfer after beginning training and were granted it. without formal sanction, in a policy the unit commander maintained because he believed that a pilot who did not wish to make the flight could not control the aircraft effectively. The unit commander's assessment of this policy, recorded in his diary, was that it was the right decision, and that he was aware of the irony of applying rational decision-making criteria to a program whose fundamental premise was the opposite of rational self-preservation.
The letters home from Ohka pilots have been collected and preserved at several Japanese archives. They document a psychological landscape that defies easy characterization. Some letters are formal and brief, expressing duty and obligation in the conventional language of the period. Some are detailed and intimate, describing the food at the base, a dream the pilot had, the weather in southern Kyushu. Some contain requests that a younger sibling be pushed to study harder, that a specific book be given to a specific friend, that parents not grieve too long. The letters that stand out are the ones that contain something that reads, under the formalities, like negotiation. Pilots trying to describe their own situation to people who had not chosen it and would have to live with its result. One pilot wrote 3 drafts of his final letter, all 3 preserved. Each one attempted to find a way to say something true and found the formalities insufficient. The 3rd draft ends differently from the first 2. The first 2 end with expressions of honor and duty. The 3rd ends with, I think of the plum tree in the garden and how it will bloom in February, and I am glad that it will. He was 21 years old. The plum tree bloomed in February of 1945. The pilot flew his mission in April. He did not return, and the plum tree was not mentioned in the official record of his service.
Between assignment to the unit and deployment, pilots waited. The waiting period varied from several weeks to several months, depending on the operational calendar and the availability of carrier aircraft. The unit was stationed at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu, close enough to Okinawa that the distant sound of heavy naval gunfire could sometimes be heard on still nights. Life at the base followed a routine that was, in the accounts of the few pilots who survived because their missions were canceled by the end of the war, simultaneously completely ordinary and completely extraordinary. There were meals, training exercises, physical conditioning. There were evenings of card games and traditional poetry reading, and the particular kind of conversation that happens among people who have acknowledged the same unusual future. One pilot, in a letter not intended for his family, but preserved anyway, wrote that the worst part of the waiting was not the knowledge of what was coming, but the absence of anything to do with that knowledge. He had accepted the outcome. He had not found a way to hold the acceptance and the ordinary daily life at the same time. He compared it to being asked to write a letter to someone you loved in a language you had never learned. You knew what you wanted to say. You had no way to say it. You kept sitting down and finding the paper blank.
Between March and August of 1945, the Thunder Gods unit launched approximately 50 operational sorties involving Ohka aircraft. The records are partial because they were partially destroyed. What the surviving records show is a pattern of consistent tactical failure combined with occasional limited success. The fundamental problem was the one identified in the first operation. The carrier bombers could not survive the fighter screen that American carriers maintained around the fleet. American radar detection extended to 80 or more kilometers. Combat air patrols were vectored to intercept incoming formations before they could reach Ohka release range of 35 kilometers. The carrier bomber, slow and unprotected, typically did not survive contact with American fighters. The Ohka pilots, sealed inside their weapons underneath the burning or diving carrier aircraft, frequently died when the mothership was destroyed. Still attached, still sealed, having never been released.
The operational planners tried to respond with doctrinal adjustments. They tried dawn attacks to reduce radar effectiveness. They tried coordinated approaches to coordinate conventional kamikaze aircraft to split the fighter screen. They tried lower altitude approaches to evade radar. None of these adjustments were sufficient to overcome the underlying problem. The weapon required delivery to a range it could not reliably reach with the only carrier aircraft available. Of approximately 50 sorties, approximately 20 to 25 resulted in a successful Ohka release. Of those releases, the confirmed hits counted in single digits.
The most documented success of the Ohka program occurred on April 12, 1945. An American destroyer was operating as a radar picket ship approximately 80 kilometers north of Okinawa. Radar picket ships were deployed to provide early warning of incoming Japanese air attacks and were among the most exposed vessels in the fleet. The destroyer had already been struck by a conventional kamikaze aircraft that morning, reducing its speed. While the crew was managing damage control, an Ohka was released by a carrier bomber at close range and struck the ship amidships at high velocity. The vessel broke apart and sank within approximately 90 seconds. 73 American sailors died. The sinking was investigated by American Naval Intelligence, which confirmed the Ohka impact from debris and survivor accounts. It was the most operationally successful Ohka strike of the program, and one of only a small number of confirmed Ohka hits in the entire campaign. According to the Navy records, this destroyer was the only vessel sunk by an Ohka in combat. Naval planners in Tokyo noted the result. The problem of carrier bomber survivability remained unsolved. The production of Ohka aircraft continued.
The Battle of Okinawa lasted from April 1st to June 22nd, 1945. During this period, the combined kamikaze and conventional air assault on the American fleet was the largest such operation in the Pacific War. Japanese naval aviation flew approximately 1,931 kamikaze sorties during the campaign, sinking 36 American ships and damaging approximately 368. The Ohka contribution to these results was, by the Japanese Navy's own assessment, disappointing. Of approximately 50 Ohka sorties, approximately 20 to 25 resulted in successful Ohka release. The confirmed sinking of the one destroyer was the only confirmed ship loss attributed to the Ohka during the entire campaign. The program had consumed the lives of hundreds of pilots, the industrial resources to build 852 aircraft, and the carrier bombers and air crews required to deliver them, and had sunk one warship. Within the context of the larger Kamikaze campaign, which had demonstrated that suicidal attack could inflict significant damage on an enemy fleet, the Ohka had performed worse than conventional Kamikaze aircraft at higher cost per sortie, because its delivery system could not overcome American fighter coverage. The program was not canceled. It was modified. Engineers began work on a jet-powered second generation with reduced size, intended to be launched from shore or submarine at greater range and higher speed than the carrier bomber could provide. Neither variant saw combat before the surrender.
The engineers who worked on the Ohka knew the carrier bomber problem from the beginning. Design review documents from late 1944 note explicitly the performance deficit of the carrier aircraft relative to the fighter environment it would face. These documents do not recommend stopping the program. They recommend developing a more capable carrier aircraft. The development of this replacement was never completed. The primary engineering concern that appears consistently in the design records is accuracy. Could the pilot reliably hit a maneuvering ship at high speed? The tests suggested an experienced pilot could. The question of what happened to that pilot afterward appears in the design documents primarily in the context of cockpit ergonomics, the dimensions of the occupied space, the placement of the controls. The absence of an egress mechanism is documented in the specifications without comment, as a feature of the design, rather than a problem to be solved. One engineer, in a personal diary entry from October of 1944, wrote, "We have built something that works. Whether it should have been built
is a question for people with different responsibilities than mine. He continued to work on the project. He was alive in 1945 when the war ended. He did not discuss this diary entry publicly until 1967.
By June of 1945, the carrier-bomber fleet assigned to the Thunder Gods unit had been reduced to a small number of serviceable aircraft. The American air campaign had been targeting Japanese airfields with increasing effectiveness. Kanoya Air Base, the primary staging point for Ohka operations, had been attacked multiple times. The runways had been repaired repeatedly. The number of aircraft capable of flying had not recovered. The pilots who had not yet been deployed continued to wait. The second-generation Ohka, powered by a jet engine and designed to be released at greater range, had completed development testing, but had not been deployed in significant numbers. The submarine-launched variant existed in prototype form. The war ended before either became operational. In the weeks following the surrender announcement, the remaining Ohka aircraft at Kanoya and other bases were accounted for by American occupation teams. The documentation from these inspections shows a careful inventory: the aircraft, their condition, the number of cockpits sealed and unsealed, the propellant remaining in the rocket motors. American engineers were interested in the technical specifications. They tested several Ohka aircraft in controlled conditions. Their assessment was that the weapon was effectively accurate when properly delivered, and that the delivery problem had never been solved. The aircraft that had never been flown in combat were subsequently dismantled. A small number were preserved for museum display. The pilots who had been assigned to the Thunder Gods unit but had not yet flown when the surrender came returned to lives that were defined in varying degrees by what they had agreed to do and then had not done. Some accounts describe a relief so profound it took years to process. Some describe a different kind of dislocation. The framework that had given the waiting its meaning had been removed, and what remained was an ordinary life that had been prepared for abandonment. Several pilots described an inability to explain their experience to people outside the unit. What you had agreed to was too extreme to discuss casually, and too specific to fit into the standard narratives of wartime service that post-war Japan was constructing around itself. Some pilots remained silent about their service for decades. When they eventually spoke, they tended to speak about the waiting rather than about the flight they never made. One pilot, interviewed in 1978, was asked what he had thought about during the months at Kanoya. He thought for a moment and said, "I thought about my family. I thought about whether they would be all right. I thought, occasionally, about whether the thing I was doing was correct. But mostly, I tried not to think too much, because thinking was not useful." He paused and added, "I think this was probably true for all of us." The Ohka program raises a question about institutional logic that is worth holding carefully. The weapon failed, by its own operational metrics, at approximately the same rate as conventional kamikaze aircraft, and at higher cost per sortie due to the delivery problem. This was known within weeks of the first operations. The program was not canceled. It was adjusted and continued. The question is not why the program was created, which is explicable within the strategic situation Japan faced in late 1944. The question is why it continued after the delivery problem was established as an irreducible constraint. The answer that emerges from the design records and operational reports is institutional. The Ohka represented a commitment to a certain kind of solution, and to abandon it would have required acknowledging that the commitment had been made in error. The unit had been named, the pilots had volunteered, the emperor had been briefed, the newspapers had written about it. Institutional momentum of this kind is not unusual in wartime organizations under stress. It is also not benign.
There is a detail in the documentation of the Ohka program that the operational records do not address directly. The weapon was designed with 1,200 kilograms of explosive in the nose section. The detonation trigger was impact activated. At the designed approach speed, the time between weapons release and impact would be approximately 30 seconds, depending on release altitude. In those 30 seconds, the pilot had 3 rockets firing behind him, the cockpit sealed, and a specific ship in front of him. The training materials describe this period as one requiring precise control input to maintain target alignment. The pilots who survived training described it in other terms, in letters, in diaries, in the occasional interview decades later. One pilot who had completed training but was never deployed wrote in a memoir published in his 70s that he had rehearsed those 30 seconds in his mind some several thousand times during the months of waiting. He had found, after extensive rehearsal, that the image he could not stop returning to was not the target. It was the plum tree in the garden at home, which he could picture in detail in every season. He said he did not know what this meant, except that the mind does not do what you tell it to, even when what you have told it is funny. The name Ohka was chosen by the pilots themselves, or by the unit, or by the Navy. The accounts vary on who proposed it. What is consistent is that the name refers to the cherry blossom, which is, in Japanese cultural tradition, a symbol not of death specifically, but of the acceptance of impermanence. The cherry blossom blooms briefly. It is most beautiful at the moment of its falling. This is understood as an aesthetic principle, as a way of seeing transience, as something that can be held at a cultural distance. When it was applied to a weapon, to the unit that flew it, to the young men who volunteered to be sealed inside it, the symbol was doing a specific kind of work. It was providing a frame that transformed what was happening into something that could be endured, that had cultural weight, that was not simply the state asking a 20-year-old to allow himself to be used as a component of an explosive projectile. Whether the frame worked for the men inside it is something the letters and the testimonies answer differently for different men. Some seem to have found it sufficient. Some seem to have found it useful, but insufficient. Some seem to have set it aside and found other frames. The plum tree that blooms in February, regardless of what you have agreed to, is its own kind of answer.
The designer of the Ohka, Ensign Mitsuo Ota, did not fly the weapon he proposed. He survived the war. He gave a small number of interviews in the post-war period. In one interview, he was asked whether he had ever considered, in 1944, when he submitted his design proposal, that the weapon he was describing would require that a person die in it, not as an incidental outcome of combat, but as a structural feature of the design. His answer, as recorded, was that he had considered this fully, and that in the context of the situation Japan was in, he had not been able to identify an alternative that would be as effective. He said that the men who volunteered to fly it understood what they were volunteering for. He said that he had believed at the time that the weapon would turn the course of the battle. He said that he had been wrong about the effectiveness, and that this was something he had thought about often. He was not asked whether he thought the design should have been built. The interviewer moved to another topic. The record of what Ota thought about the 30 seconds between release and impact, and about the men who experienced those 30 seconds in a sealed cockpit, is not preserved in any published account.
Several Ohka aircraft are preserved in museums in Japan and the United States. The American ones were captured or surrendered and shipped across the Pacific as technical curiosities, then donated to aviation collections. The Japanese ones were preserved by family members of Thunder God's pilots, or by surviving unit members, or by communities near the bases where the unit was stationed. Looking at an Ohka in a museum, which several generations of Japanese and American schoolchildren have done, it is possible to understand the engineering, the dimensions of the cockpit, the placement of the rocket motors. The nose section, which is blunt and thick, and clearly not shaped for aerodynamic efficiency, because aerodynamic efficiency was not the primary design criterion. The hatch, which opens from outside. What is not visible in the museum is the decision that was made several thousand times by 20-year-old pilots who walked across a concrete apron and climbed in. The aircraft is an object. The decision was a human event, made in a specific institutional context, under a specific set of pressures, by people who had a specific understanding of what they were agreeing to and what they were not able to fully imagine. The aircraft is preserved. Most of the letters are preserved. The 30 seconds between release and impact is not preserved in any document that has been made public.
The pilot who climbed into the Ohka on the concrete apron knew with varying degrees of clarity what he had agreed to. The account suggests that most of them had found a way to hold this agreement that made the period of waiting survivable. Whether this was belief, resignation, or something that does not fit either category is a question the letters answered differently for different men. What they shared was the institutional context. They had been asked, they had answered, and the answer was permanent. What they did not know, and what the engineers and planners knew but could not say in the rooms where decisions were made, was that the weapon they were sitting in could not reliably reach its target. The structural problem of the delivery aircraft had been documented. It had not been resolved. The men in the sealed cockpits were, in part, the cost of a decision that had been made and could not be unmade. 852 Ohka aircraft were built. The war ended before most of them flew. The ones that did fly did not change the outcome of any battle. The ones that did not fly remained on airfields until they were inventoried by occupation teams, dismantled, or placed in glass cases. Next on Torah-Files, on the island of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, Japan's army distributed grenades to civilians and explained what the grenades were for. They said surrender was not an option. In June, the army retreated south and left the civilians where they were. Torah-Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese side, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.